Hello, and welcome to the set of lectures that will cover the chemical level of organization. So, if you remember from the last set of lectures, we talked about biological organization, and that in order to build a human, you kind of build your way up with putting things together, molecules together, cells together, organs together to form an organism. So, we're at the very bottom, the simpler level of organization. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about atoms and subatomic particles. We're going to talk about the chemical bonds that hold atoms together in order to form larger molecules. We're going to talk about acids and bases and how we measure that using pH. We're going to revisit some of the major molecules found in living organisms, the organic molecules, such as carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And then finally, we'll just remind ourselves about what ATP is. So to begin, we have a couple simple drawings of an atom. Recall that atoms are made up of subatomic particles. Those subatomic particles include protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons being positively charged, neutrons being neutral, and electrons being negatively charged. And these are a couple different models of what a typical atom might look like. And really quickly, I just want to mention how important the electron shells are. So the electrons happen to kind of orbit around the central nucleus of an atom. And inside that nucleus is where you would find the different numbers of protons and neutrons. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because electrons are very important in forming certain types of bonds, holding atoms together. So we're going to talk about, for example, ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. And when we look at covalent bonds are formed when atoms share electrons. Okay, so we're not going to overcomplicate chemistry, but you have to have a fundamental knowledge of chemistry before we get to move on to bigger and better things in A&P. Here are a couple of different atoms showing their electron shells and the nucleus inside. Again, this isn't a chemistry class. I'm not going to hold you to all these different numbers and how many protons and neutrons and electrons does carbon have versus nitrogen versus oxygen. But I just want to point out that these are different atoms. Atoms have different names like hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. They have varying numbers of protons and neutrons, all found in their core, their nucleus. And then the electrons are found surrounding. Okay? Now notice hydrogen, just real quick. Hydrogen has one proton and one electron. Does not have any neutrons. Why is that important? Well, when we get to things like pH, we're going to see that pH is the measure of how many protons are in a solution. And another way to express that is to call it a hydrogen ion. Because when hydrogen loses an electron, so when this hydrogen atom loses this guy right here, it becomes H+, a positively charged hydrogen atom. Another name for that is a proton, because when hydrogen loses its electron, all it's left with is a proton. Now, I'm going to revisit this when we get to pH. So this slide is just to give you a basic knowledge of subatomic particles, and that what makes atoms different from one another is how many protons, neutrons, and electrons that atom has. Here's a whole bunch of really important atoms or elements in the human body. Now, these are going to be discussed at different points during A&P. Do we need to memorize all these things right away? No. but I just want to point out that these happen to be very, very important elements in the human body when you study anatomy and physiology. And underlined in here are why. So for example, oxygen, I don't think I need to tell you how important oxygen is. Okay, and if you've taken a biology class, you know that oxygen is important for the production of ATP. We call that aerobic cellular respiration. Carbon's extremely important because it forms the backbone of our organic molecules. Organic molecules are categorized into 4 general types: carbohydrates, lipids, which are your fats and oils, protein, and nucleic acids, which are your DNA and RNA. Those molecules are loaded with carbons, forms the backbone of those molecules. Attached to a lot of those carbons are hydrogens. Organic molecules, by definition, have carbon and hydrogen atoms. We know hydrogen's part of water, H2O. And when we get to pH, we're going to see how important H plus is. That's called a hydrogen ion. But what that also is just a single proton. Nitrogen's important. We need our nitrogen. We get nitrogen from the food we eat. We find nitrogen in protein. We find nitrogen in nucleic acids. And then you have these lesser elements. Now, lesser doesn't mean that they're not as important. It just means they're not as abundant in the human body. But calcium is just as important in it as any other element, in that if you're deficient in calcium, the body doesn't work properly. What is calcium for? We probably know how important it is for bones and teeth. It's also important for blood clotting. So when we get the blood clotting in A&P2, we'll learn how important calcium is. And it's important for muscle contraction, which is a topic in A&P1. Phosphorus. Phosphorus is the P in ATP. So it's important for the formation of ATP, which is our energy source. It's required for bones and teeth as well. It kind of goes along with calcium. It's in your bones, it's in your teeth, it helps strengthen those organs. Potassium, we talk about potassium quite a bit. It's found mostly on the inside of cells, so it's a very plentiful intracellular ion. So intracellular, it's inside of cells. It's very important for action potentials. An action potential is a nerve impulse. So when we get to the nervous system, we will definitely talk about potassium. Sulfur is extremely important. Sodium, very important for fluid. It helps us maintain fluid balance. It's also important for action potentials in the nervous system. Chloride is a negative ion. We call those anions. It's found often with sodium. So wherever you have sodium, you typically have chloride. And then magnesium, iron. You may have heard of iron as far as its importance in oxygen transport in the blood. It's part of our hemoglobin protein. So this is a list. Again, we will touch on these elements throughout A&P1 and A&P2. But I thought we should get them out there just so you understand what an element is and how important they are to the functioning of the body. Next lecture is going to talk about bonds. Bonds are a way to put atoms together to form larger molecules. So that will be the topic of the next lecture.